Hello guys and gals, me Mudahar, and welcome to another episode of Haunted Gaming, the series where we take a look at the darker side of our favorite video games. Today, of course by the title, you might be wondering what DS game you might not have heard of. And this one I'm going to put a lot of my confidence in because this is a game that I've only heard about through very, very rare and intricate means. Now, before we begin, we have to really get some context going. And one of the biggest introductions from Japan that we ever got was horror movies. If you've ever seen horror movies, you know that Japanese horror movies have a certain flair to their own. They often go for a touch more darker stories, things more abstract, and ultimately, while the scares can in a way be better than some horror movies that we make, and vice versa, they often have a unique environment to them, a unique feel that is almost unmatched by any other horror movie producing country out there, or anybody else that's making a horror movie. They have a certain flair that is best left to them. Now, some notable horror movies include Ringu, Ju-on, and me personally, I'm just getting into some a Battle Royale, for instance. I'm actually reading the manga right now, and I'm trying to get a hold of the movie to watch later. From what I have been reading, I have been enjoying that story all the way through, but that's another story for another time. The game that we're focusing today is almost a direct adaptation, or at least takes massive influence from the movie Ring. Now Ringu, whatever you want to call it, has had its franchise both in Japan, but also in the States as well. In fact, as far as I recall, there are 3 movies related to the Ring franchise here in America. We have Ring, we have the sequel to The Ring, and then we have the latest released Rings, or so to speak, which was a very recent production, one that I actually went to theaters to see, but unfortunately the movie, in my opinion, was not good enough, and I completely did not pay any attention at all. It was the worst theater experience that I might have had in my life. The game we're looking at today is Nanashi no Game, literally translated to the game with no name. It's by Square Enix, who produced it, and Square Enix is no big surprise. They are one of the biggest producers, publishers in Japan at this moment in time. In fact, all over the world. You might have heard of them making games such as Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, basically a merger of Squaresoft and Enix Productions, to the point creating one of the biggest conglomerates on the entire planet. They make a lot of games, lots and lots of games, remasters, initial IPs, games that have taken over, cult hits, whatever you want to name it. Sometimes they bring their games over to us over here stateside or European audiences, but most of the times a lot of these games and whole franchises actually stay in Japan, and it's more so to do with the actual subject matter behind it. This franchise that we're looking at, Nanashi, which I'll subtext it as, is a franchise that is only in Japan. In fact, it includes one DS game, its sequel DS game, 2 DSiWare titles, and 2 phone apps for the iOS and Android devices respectively, which are only in Japan. And the Android applications are so exclusive that they're through the Square Enix Store application for Android devices. It's very weird how this stuff gets distributed. Point is, we have never seen this touch our side of the world. The only reason I know of this game is growing up, there was a place near Toronto, Markham, for example. Actually, not for example, right where it's at. There's a place called Pacific Mall. Pacific Mall was a place that was raided numerous times for selling pirated DVDs, pirated games, and whatnot, but they still continue to do so to this day. If you ever want to get an R4 flash cart and you live in the area, Pacific Mall is the best place to go. They literally have stalls, vendors over there. You just go there and you can find almost any flash cart, whatever homebrew devices you want, are available at this area. And that's where I ended up getting 2 of my R4 carts from. When I was younger, R4 carts were a way for you to basically pay full price once, and then you could download ROMs or whatever all you wanted. I'm not going to say that I was, completely infallible from doing that. I was a younger individual back then. I couldn't really afford the newest of, I couldn't really go out and get every new DS game. And even more so than that, it was often a matter of convenience. Do I want to carry DS carts around, or do I want to have it all in ROMs? But moving on, Nanashi no Game shipped off in one of those cartridges that I had purchased. One of the vendors at the time, I know this is going to sound kind of creepypasta-ish, but one of the vendors had actually taken a ROM pack they downloaded through a torrent website and just put that onto the R4. So I had a bunch of games. I had Starfy, I had Mario's, I had every big game you could imagine for the DS, and then some. And one of those was Nanashi no Game. Now initially I got the Japanese version of the game, but I managed to hunt down an English patch ROM and actually play a significant chunk of the game through English entirely, which is actually a really good English translation, which we'll get into. But essentially, this game is the perfect creepypasta game. It centers around an urban legend that is spread basically through something called a TS, the twin screens, this game's version of a DS. A lot of games did that, but this is the way it pseudo breaks the fourth wall. Essentially, your TS downloads a game ROM or something of the sort, which is transferred from victim to victim. And as you get this ROM, you'll realize you can play it and get a story out of it. And as you play this TS ROM, you're supposed to solve these explorations in real life in the game. So the game has multiple bouts of gameplay. It's got this visual novel story, which is how it tells you most of the story, and then it's got this 3D exploration game, which plays like a book game, which when the DS was out, it had a bunch of different play styles. One of the big popular ones was the book style of play, which was popularized in games like Brain Age and Hotel Dusk. Now, after you got this 3D exploration puzzle out, which was very, very good looking, by the way, it was very detailed for being on the DS, and it ran really well. You then went to this ROM section of the game, the cursed game as it wanted to call it, the Nanashi no game, if you will. And in it, you basically were given foresight and clues as to figure out puzzles in the real world, and that would be how you would solve this overarching mystery, which was basically Ringu in game format. The game isn't too terribly long, and it can be finished in about 6-ish hours if you really explore the 3D element of it, and the ROM version of it too, which you need to actually do both to uncover all these items that you're going to need to get the best ending in the game possible. There's 2 endings, so, you know, be very explorative if you're going to play this game all the way through. It's got a lot of atmosphere to it as well. It's one of those games that advertises it has 3D sound, which means that it has stereo sound and you can hear, certain characters or monsters or whatever you will in certain ears more so than the other. It's actually a big plot point of the game. The game even makes a big deal out of it by telling you, oh, I hear a certain thing from the left side or the right side, or so to speak. But as you move through the 3D segment, while I said it is incredibly detailed for a DS game, and it does perform well, but my problem is it gets a little bit too boring for my taste. It's got this weird control scheme where you have to hold the middle part of it down. You can move the stylus left, right, up, down to sort of move your vision, but you can also use the D-pad under it to move faster or strafe. It's kind of weird, and honestly, because I might be playing on the new 3DS, the way that it's positioned actually just ends up hurting my thumb a little bit. So it's got an interesting control scheme that ultimately just can hit you. The story, though, makes up for it, and that's where I think the biggest thing about it is. It's got this combination of semi-fourth wall breaks with these TS sequences, this emailing, and it makes a great DS horror game. In fact, the environments look so good, it almost gives me this PT Silent Hill-like theme. And I know I mentioned that game franchise that never released a whole heck of a lot, but I only mentioned it because that is actually the atmosphere that I want out of most of my horror games. If you can deliver me a PT-like experience, you're doing a good job. And this game, it doesn't rely on things like jump scares. What it does is it relies on this creepypasta ROM that fits in with this 3D world, and the 3D world isn't just a screamer-filled territory. It's a place with slow building tension that lasts through the whole thing. It's not like there's Slender Man that's going to pop up like some of these creepypasta games do. It's a feeling that lasts as you play through the game entirely. Even in areas that necessarily will not offer you scares, you still get that uneasy feeling, and that's what makes this game really sweet. And this is coming on a system that had all type of genres available, and it can give you some of the most atmospheric horror you can get. In fact, this isn't the only game. There's other games like Dimension on the DS, the original DS, which offer a similar-esque feel. It's just a story that almost makes you feel like you're in a video game adaptation of The Ring, and a good video game adaptation, because it actually uses the medium to great strength. The story can even get dark, too. Nintendo almost doesn't even care about the family-friendly nature of it. In fact, I don't think they cared about it back in the days of the DS. That's why a lot of these games exist in the way that they are. Nothing has been cut out. The game can get pretty dark, and there is a lot of grim elements to this game as well that you will uncover as you get deeper and deeper into it. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it's a franchise. It's a sequel came out a year later, which, exactly a year later actually, which actually dealt with the same cursed RPG game as well as a platformer RPG, and both of these obviously coincided into one overarching story. Now, it had the same overarching story. In fact, some of the locations were really similar. You'd be kind of pressed to realize that both of them might have been the exact same game with how they play in a way. But then it had 2 DSiWare games, which are basically just independent titles released onto the Nintendo Store, and then it had applications, which again were released for the iOS first, then Android, but only in Japan. In fact, even when I tried to make a Japanese Apple account to try to see if I could find Nanashi no Apply, again the app with no name, I couldn't end up finding it. Maybe it doesn't exist for the phones anymore. Square Enix sort of has a habit of abandoning support for games that don't really work well, but they tend to keep up games that are very active in the roster. Obviously Final Fantasies, Dragon Quest. It can be understood why Nanashi no Apply didn't really make the cut. Maybe it wasn't really downloaded a whole bunch. They had a Dark Souls-esque application for their phone where it had the platformer game, but it was so incredibly difficult that that was a draw towards it, and it actually got some notable success on YouTube. A lot of people that were from the States and Europe actually ended up playing it for a brief period while it was still available. I'll look for these in another video. Right now this is just about the original game. Now, fan community translating this game to English actually worked really well too. Of course, as you know, the game is entirely in Japanese, and rightfully so. It's a Japanese release game, and it's very Japanese-centric, but the community around it was clearly available. There was actually a market for this game, if you ask me. People went out in droves to get DS horror games whenever they did come out, such as Dimension. So for a game like Nanashi no Apply, or Nanashi no Gemu, or whatever you want to call it, it could have had a perfect market over here in the stateside. Clearly a market if they're translating the game well enough. And to be honest, it's the finest DS game that is unheard of, and one of them that is criminally underrated. You know, you have a system with a lot of impressive titles, but some of those titles never get mentioned because they're either not first party or they're only Japanese exclusive, where even in Japan they might not sell a whole heck of a lot because the traditional market in Japan is so catered towards a specific type of game for that specific platform that maybe Nanashi no Gemu didn't make sense to. But I guarantee you it would have worked fine here in the States and in Europe to a limited capacity. Obviously, I'm not expecting to sell, you know, Metroid Prime Hunters level of copies, but we're expecting to sell something. But that's been the story of the application with no name, the game with no name, the perfect creepypasta title for nothing but the Nintendo DS. And it's a game you can get your hands on if you can import it through. As far as I recall, the Nintendo DS has no region locking, so you might be able to get your hands on this. I wouldn't really know how to get a, you know, ROM version of this. I wouldn't know that at all. Of course, there's a whole torrent of information available that you can check out. I do not promote it. That being said, this has been another episode of Haunted Gaming, the series where we take a look at the darker side of gaming. If you like what you saw, please like, comment, and subscribe. Dislike if you dislike it. This is me, Mudahara, and I am out.